Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Today's guest is Scott Coley. He's the author of Ministers of Propaganda, which is an absolutely amazing book that dives into some of the most dangerous propaganda that is spread not just behind fundamentalist pulpits in America, but also behind the alt-right podiums in conservative politics. It's a really fascinating book and one that is continuing a conversation that's been somewhat ongoing, both privately and in a public way, from me about the nature of politics and how that links in to religious fundamentalism. For those of you adverse to political conversations, as always, you may want to skip this particular episode if you want to avoid all political discourse. But I think if we can all listen, there's some really good points here that Scott makes that are really helpful no matter what side of the aisle you may find yourself. So without further ado, let's get into today's conversation with Scott Coley. I guess first and foremost, what prompted you to write the book and how much did George Soros pay you to write the book?
Sadly, I've gotten no remuneration from George Soros.
Okay. Well, we got that out of the way then,
Yeah. But George, if you're listening, I'm open to that. The book came out of my reflections on kind of I guess you might say a dual problem that I outline pretty early on in the introduction. And that would be, number one, certain political, social, cultural viewpoints, but primarily the way that certain social and cultural preferences find expression in evangelical political participation that I find problematic in light of Scripture and my understanding of the Christian tradition, coupled with another problem, which is more epistemic or cognitive or sort of intellectual, which is that many white evangelicals appear to be inhabiting an alternate reality. And the way that those two problems interact is sort of tricky, right? Because if you want to get people to understand why their political participation is problematic, given the axioms of Christian theology, you have to overcome some cognitive obstacles there as well. There are certain thought terminating moves that a lot of white evangelicals are apt to make. And so, yeah, I mean, that's what motivated the project. And then the realization that these two things are connected, not only in terms of, you've got to solve one to solve the other, right? But they're connected in the sense that there's a feedback loop between cognition and social practices, which I'm sure we'll elaborate on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting even diving into this because obviously it's every single topic and sentence of your book touches on a hot button issue in some way. And I'm sure you're going to get your fair amount of criticism for, piece by piece of the book from different influencers on various sides of the aisles here. I'm curious, when you go into approaching something like this, you're dealing with really two people. You're dealing with people who are the people spreading the propaganda, who are the ones who are protecting their positions of power. They're protecting the hierarchies they built. They're very knowingly trying to propagate things that will keep them in that position. But then I think the more challenging people to deal with are the people who consume the propaganda, who unknowingly, unwittingly are participating in things that, fuel that propaganda, fuel that ideology that gives those people power. And it was interesting preparing for this interview. I was listening to a lot of your interviews. I was reading through your book, and I listened to what I now know is the last interview you did before this was your Ali Stuckey interview. And you guys went round and round about the phrases that she was using, like, groomer, the Save Our Children kind of movement, and how that's linked to conspiracy theories. And near the end of the conversation, after disagreeing, she said it almost sounds like you're implying that people who are using these words are unwittingly fueling a larger conspiracy theory. And you could tell by your face, you're like, yeah, that's it. So why are we doing it? So how do you go about challenging the way people even use their vocabulary to create a better system, better dialogue, and more helpful conversation, even though that's something that's so embedded in discourse and evangelicalism?
That was an interesting conversation. The tone of it was sort of adversarial.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that, at least in terms of the points that I was there to make, there wasn't really much substantive disagreement.
Right.
But of course, there's in rhetorical contexts like that, there may be considerations on one side
Mhm.
around sort of not wanting to concede certain points explicitly.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's interesting, right? The question between, so I try not to take a position in the book, even with respect to uh, those I guess we might call ministers of propaganda, which is to say ecclesial authorities or people in positions of influence
Mhm.
who perpetuate certain kinds of propaganda. I don't really take a position on whether they're doing it intentionally. In
Right.
some cases, it's difficult to imagine that it's not intentional, and I may have personal views on that. But I can't know someone else's motives. I can't know
Mhm.
someone else's intent. So I try to remain ambivalent on that question.
Yeah.
But then, sort of, okay, what do we do about it? Because that sort of makes it, on some levels, even more difficult to untangle if people are doing it unintentionally. I mean, as I say, sort of toward the end of the book, I'm not terribly optimistic about our prospects
Mhm.
for reforming the cognition of people who have completely bought in to the ideology of the religious right. I don't think that, for example, Franklin Graham, just to take a name that
Right.
we're all familiar with, I don't think that Franklin Graham is going to pick up a copy of my book and read it and then sort of realize that, he's got it all wrong. I'm
Right.
not optimistic about that. My objective, I guess, is to give language to those who are either persuaded that the ideology of the religious right is problematic, or maybe have sort of begun the process of disentangling their faith from right wing political commitments, or, people who are sort of in the middle, or maybe, I guess, in terms of this conversation, a bit right of center. I'm not convincing folks on the alt right or the far right.
Yeah.
I want to give language and concepts that are portable, that can be carried into various contexts and conversations, to say, oh, this is the move that they're making here.
Mhm.
And this is why it's problematic. And I take time in the book, you may have noticed, not just to say, look, here's how this position actually benefits this person. And that's why they're adopting this position, because, it's keeping them in power. I do point that out, right?
Mhm.
But before I do that, I'm very careful to show why the argument doesn't work on its own terms. Even if
Right.
we assume this person is operating in good faith, even if we, set aside motivated reasoning, even if we
Mhm.
set aside their personal or political interests, here's why it just doesn't work on its own terms. Then a very natural question to ask is, okay, well then why are they making the argument
Mhm.
if it just doesn't work, right? Logically. Well, then it makes sense to ask questions about, how it might preserve or perpetuate certain social relationships.
Yeah. Well, you
So I try to
mentioned
do both.
yeah, you mentioned motivated reasoning, and that was one of those things you mentioned earlier, thought terming cliches, and that was a phrase I heard maybe 2 or 3 years ago reading, I believe it was Stephen Hassan's book, and I was uh, the first time I ever understood that concept, I was like, you hear it everywhere. And motivated reasoning in your book is very similar in that way for me, as I wrote it down immediately once I read it. And motivated reasoning is reasoning that's motivated by self-interest. And I think in this conversation of the people spreading the propaganda, you see that constantly. But I'm curious, why do you see so many in this conversation, evangelicals, that will go against their own self-interest to embrace propaganda? You mentioned in your book things like in the economy, convincing lower middle class, whites or poverty level whites to say, the issue is immigration. The issue is this other ethnicity. It's not where all the money is in our community. It's not where all the money's going within these businesses. The issue is like some other racial issue that keeps the racial hierarchy in check. Like, how do people keep biting that hook that's getting them stuck in these systems that doesn't benefit them?
How is it that politicians consistently manage to persuade large numbers of poor and working class white people to vote against their own economic interests? I think the bottom line answer comes down to race. In chapter 5 of the book, I lay out the history here, right? So I go from let's start with Nixon. So, approximately halfway through the history that I lay out there. Nixon was a social democrat, right? He was pro-union, pro-labor. The highest marginal tax rate under the Nixon administration, which was lower than it had been, was in the 70s. 70%. North of 70%, right? And without getting into the details of the prior history that I lay out, it was obvious at a certain point that poor and working class voters were not going to go for a policy of economic austerity. This was in the shadow of the New Deal prior to Nixon. And poor working class whites in the South, yeah, they resented federal intervention to enforce civil rights, but they knew that the federal government was paying their bills. They knew that. The New Deal was living memory. Nixon engaged in a lot of race baiting, but at the same time, he offered poor and working class white voters an economic policy that served their economic interests, while at the same time indulging racial resentment. So he comes out against, quote unquote, forced busing, which is just code for school integration.
Right.
Why? Well, because neighborhoods were segregated. So if you're going to integrate schools, people got to go across town. They're conceptually distinct, but it's a distinction without a practical difference, right?
Right.
Reagan's innovation, and there's I map out a theoretical framework for this as well, called the conservative dilemma. It's not original to me, as you see in the book. This political scientist who came up with this, Reagan's innovation, right, is to actually couch his argument for economic austerity, unlike Nixon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Remember, Nixon engaged in politics of racial resentment alongside economic policies that actually serve the interests of poor and working class white voters. Reagan comes along and he couches the argument for economic austerity in the rhetoric of racial resentment. So he says to poor and working class white voters, you know what your problem is? Your problem is actually government programs that take all of your money. What money? Right? They take all of your money and give it away to undeserving welfare recipients. Subtext, barely subtext, but subtext, undeserving Black welfare recipients. And he used racially coded language in ways that I lay out in the book. And this can't be seriously denied. Some people will say, like, well, he didn't, it's not like he was, walking around using racial slurs or whatever.
Not publicly, anyway.
Not publicly. But sure, grant that he wasn't using racial slurs in his speeches. There's just a wealth of documentation from campaign operatives and aides, notably Atwater. There's a bracing quote from him in there in chapter 5, laying out exactly what they're up to.
Yeah.
And so the way that, that's how you get poor and working class white voters to vote against their own economic interests. You persuade them that the real economic threat is not from above. It's not from tax dodging one percenters. It's not from corporations that are out to profit at all costs. It's from the poor people who benefit from government programs. Yeah. And the natural question to ask is, okay, well, if the poor people are taking all of our money, where is it?
Mm-hmm.
Are they hiding it under their mat? Like, they're like, where?
Yeah.
It's just, when you devote a moment of reflection to it, it's absurd.
Yeah. Well, that sentiment is across all of the categories you mentioned, whether gender, race, financial, like the redirect is always, it's somebody other than the people who are actually doing it. And those are the people who are in that position of power that they're trying to protect. And I'm curious on this because you lay out, I'm sure this book could have been many books or could be a much larger, thicker book than it is. And I'm curious, how did you go about picking which of these topics to cover? And were there any that were left on kind of the cutting room floor that you wish you could have included within this, among the conversation of racial hierarchy, gender hierarchy, creationism? Like, why all these ones? What do you wish you could have included that maybe you didn't?
Let me take the question about, what I sort of how I arrived at what I did include first, and then I'll elaborate on what I'd like to get to, which actually gets into some ongoing research projects that link up with the point I was just making about cultural grievance that lead to some counterintuitive voting patterns. Right? So as far as what I did include, I included what I thought was necessary to answer the basic questions that I posed in the introduction. Sort of, why is it that evangelicals have taken the sort of social, cultural, political positions that they have? And why is it that it's so difficult to get them to see why these positions are problematic? A lot of it comes down to a whole separate set of gatekeeping institutions and suspicion of secular, quote unquote, or what really amounts to outside expertise. That's been a part of the evangelical movement for a long time, and it's well documented. I mean, since the beginning, really.
Right.
But you really see it start to accelerate in the latter half of the 20th century, alongside certain anxieties about downward socioeconomic mobility.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to elaborate on, in keeping with the previous point we're making about Reagan and race, what I'd like to elaborate on is how central white evangelical ideology is to the emergence of authoritarian populism. The key ingredients for authoritarian populism are economic anxiety, real or imagined. And by the way, the economic concerns are legitimate. The middle class really is disappearing. People's kids really are, in general, in the median case, their kids really are going to be worse off materially than their parents.
Right.
That's true. I mean, I'm not sure anyone is interested in disputing that at this point.
Yeah. The why of that is going to be disputed, but the fact of it is not.
Exactly. So the why, that's the important bit, right? As far as authoritarian populism goes. So you've got anxieties about downward economic mobility, coupled with a narrative that blames, pick your group, pick your minority, immigrants, racial, ethnic minorities, religious minorities. Often, if not always, there's anti-Semitism mixed in there of various flavors. What happened is that, there was this shift in and around the 1970s, let's say. Let's say 1970s, just pick a date, where capital transformed from what we might call industrial capital to financial capital for a variety of reasons having to do with global markets and labor competition. And the transition to financial capital meant that, sort of what people with a bunch of money do when they want their money to make money is no longer build a factory and hire people to produce commodities that they can sell at a profit. No. And the transition was gradual, but by the time, we get to say 5-10 years after NAFTA, the transformation is more or less complete from industrial to financial capital. But what the people with a bunch of money who want their money to make money started doing en masse in the 1970s and after is sort of, rather than building a factory and creating more jobs, is to just invest in the debt of people whose wages have stagnated or declined. What Marx predicts is that capitalism is going to implode because of its internal contradiction. So you've got the capitalist who builds a factory, who wants to make money, and they're going to suppress wages as much as possible because, the less they pay their workers, the more profit they're going to make. Well, workers are also the consumers in the market. So if you've got a bunch of factory owners paying their workers as little as possible, basically what you're doing is suppressing effective demand, right? Because if you don't pay your workers, then they can't afford to buy your stuff and other people's stuff. And so Marx says the whole thing's going to collapse. Well, what Marx, doesn't see is that industrial capital is just going to sort of reorganize itself into financial capital. And so what's happened is that as wages have been suppressed, in order to ensure that there's still effective demand, in other words, that consumers still have money to buy things, they just offer them credit, right? Yeah. And this is supplemented by, home equity and what a lot of people were doing, which is sort of racking up a bunch of consumer debt and then refinancing their mortgage and paying off their credit cards and on and on. And this is how we get the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. If you ask, the median white evangelical what's happened, they're not, it's, the problem is that we've got to get back to, the apogee, peak America, which is, mid 20th century American values. And I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to work, but somehow things will be wholesome and you'll be able to live off of one income again. They're fuzzy on the details, but it's the collapse of the social hierarchy is what the problem is. And so, Reagan comes along and tells this story about trickle down economics, right? You let the rich people keep more of their money, they'll create jobs. Of course, this is a fantasy, and but white evangelicals believe it, a lot of them. So
Yeah. I'm curious in this list of things that you mentioned, like economics is a big piece of this, the racial hierarchy, which I think, I mean, I want to say it's just like indisputable, like the racial issues and a lot of the propaganda around it, but it clearly isn't. And we've seen such a fluctuation just in the last couple of years of who the racial boogeyman is, like we went from, you know, we went from the Middle East during Trump running to now anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are at a like all-time high over the last couple of years. You can see the gender divides and things. There's a lot in the book that feels pressing and timely. And then it's interesting, like reading through, and then you hit creationism. And for myself, when I saw it in the lineup of issues, I was like, I didn't expect to see creationism in here. And so I'm curious, how did creationism enter the picture in terms of propaganda to discuss and ideologies that are a massive part of kind of the religious right? Where does it fit among these other issues that feel a lot more surface level violent and scary to look at versus creationism, which might at worst feel kooky, when you watch like a Ken Ham video or something?
I'm not sure I would have included creation science in there prior to the COVID pandemic, but I thought that a lot came to light there about white evangelical attitudes toward the scientific establishment in particular and outside expertise in general. The basic idea is like, look, I mean, we've basically been telling a whole bunch of white evangelicals that the scientific establishment and mainstream media and elites, cultural elites and education and
Whoever
so
the
on.
elites are.
Right. Yeah. Whatever that means. Whenever somebody calls me an elite, I'm like, I'll show you my pay stubs if you want. I mean,
Right.
I didn't get into this industry to make money. Not a sincere offer. I'm not actually going to show you my pay stub. But no. Yeah. So yeah, whoever the elites are, right? And it's like, well, look, I mean, we've been telling a bunch of white evangelicals for a few generations now,
Right.
that all of these, elites and institutions are lying to them for whatever reason, or maybe just misinforming them. I mean, it's not, maybe they're not, knowingly lying, right? But the scientists have got it all wrong,
Right.
and it's very, I mean, this is where the motivated reasoning is really acute, right? Because it's not that evangelicals distrust all science. They take their cholesterol medication. They will use GPS navigation. They will trust science when it's convenient. But the moment that scientific expertise problematizes or calls into question the social, cultural, or political objectives of the religious right, then all of a sudden the scientists are all wrong. Where does this pattern start? Again, there's always been this anti-intellectual impulse in American evangelicalism. But where it starts to get really acute is in and around the 1960s and with the creation science movement. And as I researched it, it's like, well, young earth creationism was not the prevailing view, even among fundamentalists.
Yeah.
Prior to the second half of the 20th century.
And that's, you mentioned the book, but that's specifically the US, like where it really exploded. And that was something that was fascinating to me, coming out of a very fundamentalist background where we watched the Ken Ham stuff all the time and all these types of creators within that space. Is I started working after I graduated. I started working with a couple of people on a project who were from the UK who were Christians. And it was fascinating hearing them talk about like, oh, they were, about evolutionary, Christian thinking. And I was like, I didn't even know that was a thing. It felt like an oxymoron. But then you start going, everybody's got theories and everybody has their own explanations for this. It's when you pick yours and then everything else is judged by your standard, which I think is interesting. So anyway, I just wanted to insert that not only is it relatively new, it's relatively new to a very concentrated area, like within the United States. It's not a like international agreed upon type of thing.
No. And it's, and there, I think, another thing that's really illustrated by young earth creationism and creation science is the relationship between the theology,
Mm-hmm.
and then the sort of culture industry, which is, the theologians kind of tee it up by saying, look, this is the biblical view.
Yep.
Right. And then the creation scientists take it from there and say, well, look, I mean, this is the biblical view. So, we can set aside sort of the scientific establishment story about, the origins and all that. We can just dismiss it. And what ends up happening is that you get folks in this subset of the creation science industry who they're basically just saying stuff, right? And they're not actually interacting with legitimate biblical scholarship. And also they're not interacting with legitimate scientific research.
Because they've established that they're independent of it. They don't need its validation.
By definition, their view is the biblical view. And we shouldn't expect them to agree with the secular scientists, because the secular scientists don't take the Bible seriously. So what are we relying on? I don't know. It's just Ken Ham's just making stuff up.
Right.
And you see this, there's this intellectual no man's land where, there's somebody spouting purportedly biblical views, and we're all just supposed to take that as orthodox.
Right. Yeah.
There's no basis in history, no basis in anything really. It's and what the interesting part about it, right, from the standpoint of ideology, that maybe it would be helpful to say something about how sort of the mechanisms by which ideology operates. There's a feedback loop between social practice and cognition. So there's a particular kind of social arrangement or social practice that you favor, right? And that's actually going to and then also your experience of certain social practices into which you've been enculturated, and that's actually going to affect how you think about things, right? And so, what's interesting here is that the creation science movement picks up steam in the 1960s. But the other interesting bit is like the arguments aren't new. They go back to George McCready Price in the 1920s, right? So, but nobody really understood or paid much attention to Price's work, but they take up different iterations of it in the 1960s. Well, what's happening socially in the 1960s? All of a sudden, there's an interest in getting out of public schools, right? And there's an interest in...
They wanted better education, right? That's the reason they split off from the public school.
No, exactly. They didn't want their kids being taught evolution. It had absolutely nothing to do, wink, wink, with the fact that public schools had been integrated and, and so on. And so it's like, okay, well, the arguments aren't new. The theology isn't actually orthodox. And I mean, I unpack all of that, right? So what's actually going on when a whole bunch of white evangelicals say, oh, we're young earth creationists now, and we think Ken Ham and John MacArthur and Al Mohler know more about the physical history of the earth than all of the combined wisdom in paleontology, archaeology, and on and on. I mean, we're talking about a couple dozen scientific subdisciplines.
Right. And the leading experts are non-scientists, which is interesting perspective. Just this total side note. Have you ever seen the movie Inherit the Wind that came out in 1960? It's about the school teacher that gets arrested for teaching evolution.
Oh, the Scopes trial?
Yeah, I mean, it's based on that, but they change the names and things, but it's a really cool movie. If you haven't seen it, it's worth watching. But there's a lot of really great conversations between these two lawyers that grew up together, and they have this conversation on the porch in the midst of this trial, and they're going head to head. One's very much the fundamentalist preacher, like banging his Bible. The whole town is like cheering him, having parades walking into town. And there's this other lawyer that's kind of arguing for like new thoughts and new ideas. And they have this conversation on the porch about, if things never change, eventually the world passes you by. And it's a really cool movie, and it's relevant to this discussion. And they have a lot of these kind of debates with each other.
Funny how two people can start from the same point, drift apart.
It's the nature of the life process.
There used to be a mutuality of understanding and admiration between us, Henry. Why is it, my old friend, that you've moved so far away from me?
No, all motion is relative, Matt. Maybe it's you who have moved away by standing still.
If progress means abandoning God, abandoning the faith of our fathers.
I saw a demonstration of that faith tonight. It's a pretty deadly instrument, I'd say.
What you saw was a reflection of the violence and hate in the world around them, Henry. Your world. But they're driven to it because their faith was challenged. These are simple people, Henry, poor people. They work hard and they need to believe in something beautiful. They're seeking for something more perfect than what they have.
Window shopping for heaven.
And where do you want to take it away from, Henry? It's all they have. Like a golden chalice of hope.
When is it set? Is it set in the 1920s?
In
all likelihood, the fundamentalist preacher in that movie, if it were reality and it had been taking place in the 1920s, that fundamentalist preacher would have been advocating some version of old Earth creationism, right? According to which the Earth is in fact millions of years old, or as old as you like, right? And one of the interesting things to me is that now Albert
and
Buller,
it is set in the 1920s. You're right. So I knew it was based on the Scopes trial, but I didn't remember if they kept the time frame. Yeah,
so is the fundamentalist a young Earth creationist or older? Is he saying the Earth was created a few thousand years ago in 6 24-hour days?
I believe that's his perspective in it.
Well, that would not have been the median view, even among fundamentalists.
That's interesting that
at the time. And what's fascinating is that you've now got certain young Earth creationists, right, who will say that, you know, even and I list them in the book, right? The fundamentalists in the 1920s would say that they're liberal and they don't actually take the Bible seriously. I mean, like, what? How do you?
Yeah.
Those are the moments where it's sort of like, again, I try to not take a position on whether the arguments are given in good faith, but those are moments where it gets the rationale for taking it at face value gets rather thin. Because it's like, so I'm like, I know that these guys have read books.
Well,
you know,
some have read books. Some of the leading thought leaders lately, I question whether they've read any books. Yeah, I think this is interesting, and I think it's one of the things where when you look at context, which is something I think people fail to do when establishing like these arguments, you look at context of when these ideas came to prominence. You look at the social anxieties of the 60s and 70s, and you look at, I mean, across the board, when you look at sexual liberation happening in the country, you look at, you know, racial integration happening, which you mentioned, like there's so many things that were leading people to tighten their grip on the status quo of the time, you know? And so it's fascinating seeing it, but it's also fascinating to me seeing that not much has changed. And this is the feeling I had listening to Kristen Dumais' book, Jesus and John Wayne, is, and I mentioned this in our conversation, was the stuff she's describing during the Nixon era is the same things we're dealing with now. In some areas, the dog whistles are more like bullhorns in some of the conversation now. But all of these issues and all these fights are the same. It's just like the labels on things have changed a little bit, or the way that we, like how explicit we are about some things have changed here and there. But like the boogeymen have relatively stayed the same because the boogeymen work. I'm curious on this front, with all of these different topics and dealing with conversations that are so rife with links to conspiracy conversation. Like every phrase seems to be linked to something that is not helpful. You know, like I cover a lot of abuse stories on my show, and the Save Our Children movement is such a mess of I mean, it's linked to so many crazy, bizarre theories. You know, the groomer conversation, like all of these things that sound like they're tools to push forward a good agenda or a good thing. Ending abuse is good. Ending human trafficking is good. But they're linked to these really horrific things. Like, how do we go about removing conversations from like these politically leveraged like belief systems that are really unhelpful? Because it feels like everybody you talk to, like you can ask them, what do you believe? And then you have to like dig deeper to go like, Okay, but what does that word mean to you? What does that phrase mean to you before you can have any kind of productive conversation? Like, how do we start stripping away some of the, I guess, added meaning to so many common phrases in discourse today?
Well, that is a difficult problem because, the phrases you reference and the concepts are couched in an ideological framework within which they make a certain kind of sense.
Yeah.
If you are coming at them from a very particular kind of perspective,
Mhm.
right? The sort of paradigm example here is white supremacy and race-based chattel slavery in the antebellum South, and arguments in favor of perpetuating that system that appealed to liberty, right? To the modern ear, that sounds rather perverse, right? Because of course, the ideal of liberty is one of the principal motivations. It's the core of the argument for abolishing the institution of slavery, right? Because it violates people's right to liberty.
Yeah.
If one is approaching the subject with the perspective that there's this certain racial hierarchy in which some people own property and other people are property, then abolishing the institution of slavery amounts to depriving people at the top of the hierarchy of the liberty to own a particular kind of property, namely slaves. And it is perverse, but to those who are enculturated into this ideology of white supremacy, that rhetoric makes perfect sense. So how do you get around that sort of conceptual blockade? You sort of asked me this question toward the outset, and I never really got around to answering it, apart from saying I'm not optimistic.
And that's it, everybody. It's a mess, and there's no improving it. End it right there.
Well, so I guess what I would say is that if there is hope for overcoming these impediments, I think that it has something to do with setting aside one's own interests in the pursuit of something like, well, I would say justice, right? Giving everyone their due. And I think that I'm particularly hopeful for those who are able to do this in the context of, speaking from my own experience, the Christian tradition, because this is precisely what Jesus calls us to do.
Yeah.
To set aside our own interests, to put our own interests last, right? And I think maybe this will be a helpful way of framing it. I think what a lot of white evangelicals do when they go to vote is they ask themselves which politician or party or platform is going to serve my interests. They vote for that person, the interests of Christians, whatever that means, whatever their understanding of that is. And I don't think that's the proper motivation for voting at all. I think that is actually an anti-Christian approach to politics. A different approach, which I favor, is an approach that says which politician or platform or what have you. Well, it starts with the question, what is justice, right? What do we owe to each other as citizens, as human beings? Well, what do people deserve and what do I owe? When we go into the voting booth, we ask ourselves which politician or a party or platform is going to deliver laws and public policies that conform most closely to the truth about justice, about what we deserve, what people deserve, and what we owe to each other. The answer may involve voting for someone who isn't going to lower my taxes. Which, incidentally, I mean, if you're middle class or upper middle class or below, probably no one's going to raise your taxes, appreciably. The arguments are really about how much the wealthiest people, Americans pay in taxes. And in any case, I think that the answer to sort of overcoming motivated reasoning and ideology and propaganda is to approach these questions with concern for my neighbor rather than concern for myself, what I perceive to be my interests and the interests of people who look like me or whose financial profile looks like mine.
Yeah.
And then I can start to disentangle. Then I can just look dispassionately at creation science and say, this is kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
What did you think about the bit about ice cores So the layers of ice, when they drill out an ice core from Antarctica,
I'm trying to remember.
layers, and the
Um,
chemical composition of each sort of layer is, dates back. You can count down the layers.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
And then I'm trying to remember how you phrase in the book, but you talk about like you don't. I wish I had copied this in my notes, but you're basically saying like approaching that conversation with that like knowledge being there will affect where you go from there. Like basically you were saying like some people don't bother even taking in that information because it contradicts with what their belief system is.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, how you
according
phrase it.
to certain sort of very, influential elements in the creation science movement, right? I mean, you start with the supposition that the Earth is approximately 6,000 years old, 10,000 years old, whatever, and then the job of the quote unquote scientist who holds the quote unquote biblical view is to come up with a way of explaining the empirical data that fits with the quote unquote biblical view. Well, I mean, the most natural explanation for something like the layers that you find in an ice core is that the Earth is at least hundreds of thousands of years old. You know, without even getting into physics or any of the other scientific evidence, or longer ice cores, which are outliers, just based on really simple evidence, from samples of ice, it appears the Earth is many, many, many times older than younger creationists would have it. And that if I don't have a vested interest in promoting a certain approach to interpreting the first few chapters of Genesis in order to reinforce a certain conception of racial hierarchy and gender hierarchy, then I just say, oh, okay, the Earth is hundreds of thousands of years old, at least, no problem. There's nothing, I don't lose anything by admitting that.
That's a sentence that stood out to me in it, and I found it exactly what you said. In professional context, when a scientist sits down to examine a cross-section of ice core from Antarctica, they're probably not interested in proving that the Earth is billions of years old. Do they believe the Earth is billions of years old? Almost certainly, but it's highly unlikely that that belief is directly relevant to their research. It's basically this idea that they can approach it and research it without needing to prove this specific system, or they can look at it separated from that, and it doesn't, like you said, doesn't threaten their existing belief or worldview. And also the whole point of science is that it should threaten your worldview because you're constantly taking in new information and adapting accordingly.
Well, not if you're Ken Ham, right? Because if you're Ken Ham,
Right.
Science, at least what he
It
calls
is the
historical
enemy.
science, which is the kind of science, well, the scientific establishment, sure, but according to Ken Ham, historical science, quote unquote, it's confirmation bias. I mean, that's what he's describing.
Right. Which is most sermons.
Which is not a desirable thing.
Yeah, you sit down, it's like many sermons. You sit down to write the sermon, you find the text that will prove your points that you just
Mm-hmm.
wrote down. And that kind of way of approaching it is not helpful. Well, look, I know you said you're not particularly optimistic. I find myself somewhere in that realm. It depends on the day. I feel like sometimes there's moments where I have spurts of optimism. But I want to ask you, so I would say I am unsure relatively of where I land religiously or spiritually at this current moment. I grew up in a very extremely fundamentalist world where, they were King James only, Bible believing, Baptist preacher kind of approach. And I've read a lot. I've looked at a lot of different research. I have not figured out where I land on things, but I'm curious from your perspective, like when I sit down with people like you, or I sit down with somebody like Kristen Dumais or Beth Allison Barr, or like these people where I go, man, they actually are Christians that feel sane. And I feel optimistic reading their book, or I feel optimistic listening to them on this podcast, or I feel like these are the people, like, I'm like, it seems like they're understanding more than the religious right who Jesus is, or at least was to me when I was in that system, and like the things that did appeal. But then you go to like Twitter, or you go to other, resources or other books, and like those are the people most hated by the Christian establishment. It's like, why do you think that voices like yours or the other names I've mentioned are the minority, when it really does seem to reflect this kind of like view of justice and love for everybody, and not just the person in the position of power, the pastor, the leader, the governmental voice at the moment? Why do you think that is such a minority voice?
Well, Jesus tells us that the way is narrow, right? And I think in fundamentalist, or broadly like highly conservative evangelical environments, something like these admonitions that the way is narrow, or that criticisms of people who are more concerned with pleasing men than pleasing God, those things are framed as sort of where the relevant antipathy is between people in the church and then people in the world, right? Secular culture or whatever. I don't want to say that that's, that could never be the case, but it seems to me that often the correct way to understand that opposition, the correct way of framing these admonitions is, between those in the religious establishment who are seeking to reinforce their own power and pursue their own interests, wittingly or unwittingly. I'm ambivalent about that. I think it's the most natural thing in the world to pursue your own interests. I think people absolutely can and to perpetuate the marginalization of oppressed or disenfranchised groups. I think it can absolutely be done unwittingly. There are some who do it wittingly. I don't want to give them too much credit, but it's not for me to say,
Right. And that's where you get into conspiracy theory thinking, when you start assuming all motivations and start, instead of just going, oh, this is what they're saying, let's deal with that, instead of
right. No, this is no, this is nothing in this book is conspiracy theory.
Right.
Ideology is not conspiracy.
No,
it's not. Ideology is far more ad hoc and haphazard, where people just pull things in that confirm narratives that legitimize their preferred social arrangements.
Right.
That's how this works. It's not, they're not sitting down mapping it all out. But all that to say, I find that often the real opposition between those sort of on the narrow path and those on the sort of broader, easier path is between people who pursue justice, who try to sort of upset or level established hierarchies, because I mean, look, the first will be last. I mean, how's that? That doesn't make any sense, unless what we're talking about is sort of leveling these hierarchies. Well, then that starts to make a little bit of sense, So a fruitful way of framing the opposition is between people who are following Christ and putting themselves last, or not first at any rate, and then others who use the name of Jesus to perpetuate their own interests, wittingly or unwitting.
Wow, that's great.
So that's how I understand that. And I find it totally unsurprising that people would appropriate the teachings of Jesus to people will appropriate anything that might advance their own interests. So it's not surprising.
Yeah, they'll do it in other countries with other deities. They'll do it. It's just another brand to which you can attach yourself. And
I think some of these folks, they think what's difficult about the Christian life is, well, here's what it might look like. Following Jesus is difficult because, I'm sitting next to someone on an airplane and I have to witness to them, and that's uncomfortable, at least at first. And then you get used to it and it's not uncomfortable.
Right.
And I have to, take a stand against the cultural elites who are promoting a certain social agenda that wants to normalize certain things and so I have to offend the cultural elites by insisting that we continue marginalizing people who are marginalized, and that can be, I suppose that can be uncomfortable, maybe to someone with a certain kind of personality. And then I resist the temptation to look at pornography, every man's battle, that kind of thing, to which I say, good, don't look at pornography. I think that's certainly in keeping with, the teachings of Jesus and the sweep of Scripture more broadly. But I think, as far as the discomfort of following Christ, I think it's meant to be so much more profound than a bit of social awkwardness.
Right. Yeah. Discomfort's not persecution. It's just discomfort, and I think that's I think if you take that perspective and extrapolate, it's like most of the persecution against who I would say most reflect the teachings of Jesus as I understand them, the persecution seems to be coming from the religious institutions most. Like, it seems like those are the people that are most aggressively, which I guess would
And that fits a
put you
pattern.
in that position of following Jesus, because that was who was most against him.
Yeah, I mean, when I get resistance from people in positions of influence within the church, that I mean, sorry to disappoint, but that just confirms to me that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. That's when I sleep best.
Right.
So
Yeah.
thanks.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you see this pattern throughout Scripture, in the Hebrew Bible and then in the Christian New Testament, that God is on the side of someone who is in opposition to those within often the religious establishment who are doing injustice.
Yeah.
And who are cooperating with political powers that are perpetuating injustice.
Yeah.
And often there's idolatry, and 9 times out of 10 that idolatry is linked to injustice. And then who is Christ's intention with in the New Testament? So the establishment.
Yeah.
And then I'm supposed to believe that when I'm talking about justice and concern for my neighbor and pursuing policies and laws that give everyone their due, and then I get pushback from people who are really comfortable and enjoy a certain level of influence in the religious establishment. What's that supposed to make me feel? Am I supposed to think, oh, gee, well, maybe they're right? I mean, it does nothing for me at all.
Right. Yeah. There's so much I could add into this, and so much, even as you're talking, that I'm like, I can add these all to these notes and keep asking questions. There's so many things that stand out. For anybody listening, definitely pick up a copy of the book. We're scratching the surface of so many. I could have underlined every page, especially the section just about shifting between the victim narrative to being the founder. Like, all those conversation pieces stuck out so much. But I appreciate you coming on and talking about what we could get through. I appreciate you writing the book to cover all the things that we couldn't. And I'm sure there's much more you could release, and probably will at some point, that goes even deeper on some of these. But thank you so much. For anybody who's listening, what's the best way for them to follow you, connect with you, outside of buying the book, which I should have done at the top of the show? What are some other ways they can support you and see what you're working on?
I would say Twitter is probably where I'm most readily available.
Perfect.
And that is at Scott_M_Coley. I have an Instagram page, but I don't. My spouse handles that. Honestly, I don't even know the login.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well,
and she tells me that I have a Facebook page, which I don't even think I've seen.
So if they want you, Twitter is the place to be,
right.
or X, I guess now. X, the beautiful world of X.
Sure.
The everything.
Yeah, for as long as it's around. I get
right.
Who knows how long that'll be.
Well, awesome. Well, definitely go connect with Scott over there. Links in the show notes to everything we've talked about. Scott, thanks so much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. I hope my explanation of things made sense. We covered a lot of ground.
No, I think so. And I think, my goal is for this to be a footnotes add-on to the book, in addition to a prompt to go check it out. It's one of those things that's always hard, I think, interviewing, is that I go through the book, I'm taking notes, I'm looking, I'm like, there's so much here. But then I'm also like, well, I don't want to give everybody everything that's in the book. So hopefully it's enough of a taste to get them into the entire book to read through. And for those who have read the book, hopefully it's been a helpful, add on to what you've read. But yeah, there's a million ways we could go with this conversation. So
Well, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.